Good morning, folks. Thank you for joining me today at our venerable institution to discuss a venerable book. This is going to be the first in a series that the Relic Room is putting on. My name is Joe Long. I'm the education curator here at the South Carolina Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum. So let's walk on in and we will get underway. One thing about these Mornings with Heroes sessions, we're going to be very respectful of your limited instructional time. So we're aiming at 15-minute sessions. This introductory session will be more like 20 minutes just to orient you to the book and our project together, which I'm pretty excited about. So thank you for deciding to spend a few minutes, perhaps over your morning coffee with us. And I think that anytime you spend with the book we're discussing every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 for the rest of the semester is going to be time well invested indeed. The book, many copies of it, Hero Tales of American History. In this edition, Hero Tales, How Common Lives Reveal the Heroic Spirit of America. It's been published in a number of editions since it first came out in the early 1890s, and it remains in print, but you can also find it for free online in various places, including Project Gutenberg. So if you'd like to read these stories in between our discussions of them, I highly encourage it. I think there's a lot to gain from it. And before we talk about the book, let's take just a second and introduce the authors. And what we're going to do then is take one chapter every session from here on. Here we have the gentleman who took on the project of creating this history book. And the gentleman on your left, perhaps less familiar, is the great American statesman Henry Cabot Lodge. The other gentleman you may recognize, and if you do, then bully for you. The other gentleman, of course, is Theodore Roosevelt, later president. Theodore Roosevelt, at the time when he's writing this particular book, has not even yet done his own military service as a Rough Rider. So he is still a rising individual in public life. But the two men share a firm friendship, many principles, and a deep concern, particularly a concern about the teaching of history and learning from it. One thing that Theodore Roosevelt is going to be known for as a policy is what was referred to, including by him, as Americanism. In the early 20th century, there are going to be many immigrants who are flowing into this brand new country with great prospects for them. And there's a concern that they internalize and carry forward the common values that the country was founded on. What does it mean to be an American is something each of them is going to be learning about, deciding for himself, and that their children attending the schools will also be considering. It's also, at the time of first writing, less than 30 years after the end of the terrible war between the North and the South, which also left in many minds and many memories the question of what does it mean to be an American? Lodge and Roosevelt thought that the answers to that could be found in history. And that's the story behind American Hero Tales. In fact, the book project was suggested by Teddy Roosevelt's wife, Edith, because the two men at dinner began to trade favorite history stories back and forth, and she challenged them to say, well, why don't you two write a book? And the book that emerged was American Hero Tales. And Hero Tales of American History was meant for young people and meant to demonstrate through stories of heroism and virtue what it meant to be an American. The concern that Lodge gave about how history was going to be taught, or how it was already taught in his time, Lodge asserted nearly all the historical work worth doing at the present moment in the English language is the work of shoveling off heaps of rubbish inherited from the immediate past. They thought that history was being done badly and that it was important for the future for it to be done well, especially for youngsters. And that brings us to the first of our American Hero Tales. Now, most of the essays in this book are 5 or 6 pages. There are a few more pages devoted to our first subject, and our first subject is George Washington. So, we're going to give Washington less than his due today. In fact, throughout this semester, we're going to give each subject a little less than their due. What I hope this serves as is an appetizer for history. So you'll learn some good stories each time, but I hope that they turn you toward where history is really found, which is in books, the records of the past. Washington. Washington is a name that looms so powerfully in American history and culture. And sort of the idea that we have of him often comes from artwork, from the $1 bill, the towering monument in Washington, D.C. You can see Washington in so many places and his name in so many places. Lodge and Roosevelt figured you knew about Washington as a great war leader, but there was more you needed to know about the man to really appreciate how important he was in founding the nation, but also what a model he ought to be. They quote John Richard Green, a historian from England, that no nobler figure ever stood in the forefront of a nation's life. And everyone looked at George Washington as one of the great noble figures of all time. Everyone could quote in Roosevelt's time, Light Horse Harry Lee's tribute to Washington at his funeral. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. But Lodge and Roosevelt are not there simply to praise, but as Lodge said, to shovel away some of the rubbish that was told about history. So, to understand Washington at all, we must first strip off all the myths which have gathered about him. We must cast aside into the dust heaps all the wretched inventions of the cherry tree variety, which were fastened upon him nearly 70 years after his birth. We must look at him as he looked at life, and the facts about him without any illusion or deception. No man in history, they assert, can better stand such scrutiny. So, this quintessential American hero, they start with his origins. Born of a distinguished family, Washington started with all that good birth and tradition could give, not with what money could give. Beyond this, they write, however, he had little. His family was poor. His mother left early a widow, and he was forced, after a very limited education, to go out into the world to fight for himself. He had strong within him the adventurous spirit, became a surveyor, plunged into the wilderness, grew to be an expert hunter and backwoodsman. Even as a boy, the gravity of his character and his mental and physical vigor commended him to those about him. Military command was put in his hands at an age when most young men are just leaving college. What is important? What are they pulling out of Roosevelt's early life here? That it wasn't the advantages of money. And later in life, he would be prominent and a wealthy planter, but of the challenges he met that developed him. Theodore Roosevelt was famous for promoting the strenuous life, to go out and meet challenges and grow through them, whether you experience victory or defeat. And he emphasizes that in the life of his own hero, Washington. When the troubles came with France, it was by the soldiers under his command that the first shots were fired in the war that would determine whether the American continent should be French or English. In his early expedition, he was defeated by the enemy. Later, he was with Braddock, and it was he who tried to rally the broken English army on the stricken field near Fort Duquesne. On that day of surprise and slaughter, he displayed not only cool courage, but also the reckless daring, which was one of his chief characteristics. Bullets passed through his coat and hat. The Indians and French who tried to bring him down thought he bore a charmed life. He served with distinction throughout that war. So, Washington, in his earliest military command, as an officer with the British forces fighting against the French, his enemies later on, he meets defeat. Not only does he meet defeat, he survives disaster. And in the course of doing that, displays cool courage and reckless daring. These are things that the authors see as definitive to the American character. That Washington, in the midst of defeat and disaster, doesn't lose his head and does not give in to fear. This is extra significant when you look at George Washington's Revolutionary War battles, something we don't have time to dig into today. Washington does not have a lot of winning battles in the American Revolution. Instead, he has defeats that do not destroy him. He has an army that he manages to rally and inspire confidence in time and again, not because they have attained great successes, but through the personal respect that he gets from the men. There was something about him even then which commanded respect and the confidence of everyone who came in contact with him. They go then into his appointment as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in the American Revolution and give very few details in Hero Tales about that. Barely mention it because it was thought in the 1890s that every American school child was familiar with the basics of those battles. Instead, to demonstrate his leadership, the emphasis is on what Washington did immediately after the war. So we start with the strenuous life, the tough frontier life that he applied himself to, that grew him into the leader that he became. But then, at his moment of greatest triumph, what does Washington do that Americans admire the most? He steps down. When George Washington finds himself the idol of the country and of his soldiers, the army was unpaid, and the veteran troops were eager to have him take control of the disordered country, as Cromwell had done in England a little more than a century before. With the army at his back, supported by the great forces which desire order before everything else, nothing would have been easier than for Washington to have made himself the ruler of the new nation. George Washington would eventually be elected our first president, but not immediately upon the end of the war, and not by marching in with the army and declaring himself in charge, which everyone thought it was the most likely thing for the successful general of a revolutionary army to do is, okay, now we won, now I'm taking over. When King George of England heard that George Washington was going to step down, turn in his sword, and go back to the life of an ordinary farmer, he was astonished and said that if that was true, it would make Washington the greatest man of the age. It's exactly what Washington did, establishing a permanent American principle that military power doesn't dominate our civil government, that the soldier is someone who responds to the orders of the civil government, not a leader who uses force to take it over. Since Washington's time, we've had other great generals leave the military, go into politics, and be elected president, but not by forging in at the head of an army. And it was this that they wanted to kick off with to show young people and older people who were reading the hero tales what it meant to be an American. Part of that was the self-discipline and the foresight that said, we're going to make the best long-range decision here, not immediately take over, restore order, and find ourselves as yet another monarchy. Now, our time grows short. I am limiting myself for 20 minutes here. So I do want to encourage you to get a hold of and look at the first essay in Hero Tales by Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge, the one on George Washington. And we'll end with remarks made upon his character. Whether measured by what he did or what he was, or by the effects of his work upon the history of mankind, in every aspect he is entitled to the place he holds. Few men in all time have such a record of achievement. It is always important to recall and remember just what manner of man he was. He was physically a striking figure, very tall, powerfully made, with a strong, handsome face. He was remarkably muscular and powerful. A leader in all outdoor sports as a boy. No one could fling the bar further than he, or ride more difficult horses. He became a woodsman and hunter. He could tramp through the wilderness with his gun and surveyor's chain and sleep at night beneath the stars. He feared no exposure or fatigue and outdid the hardiest backwoodsman in following a winter trail and swimming icy streams. An educated but not learned man, he read well and remembered what he read, but his life was a life of action. He was, in addition, what very few great soldiers or commanders have ever been, a great constitutional statesman, able to lead a people along the paths of free government without undertaking himself to play the part of the strong man, the usurper, savior of society. A very silent man. Of no man of equal importance have we so few sayings of a personal kind. One quality he had, which was perhaps more characteristic of the man and his greatness than any other, is perfect veracity of mind. He was, of course, the soul of truth and honor, but more than that, he never deceived himself. He always looked at the facts squarely in the face and dealt with them as such. He gave dignity as well as victory to the country. So, that ends our discussion of George Washington. I've brought that in 20 minutes, and future sessions should be 15. I am going to cheat just a little bit because I have two artifacts on the tray in front of me here that we haven't talked about. So if you're going to see us again next Tuesday at 9 a.m. for our next Mornings with Heroes, I'll see you then. If you can hang on for just a minute, I got a couple beautiful artifacts here. And they each say something about George Washington, our subject today, and the esteem in which he was held. The first of these items is an award, not an award that Washington received, but one that he instituted. It was the only medal that would be given in the Continental Army. And at the time, of course, it did not yet have George Washington's face featured on it. You may recognize this award, though, that is still given in the American military. Over the years, it has gone from being, in the Continental Army, it was a Medal for Valor. Today, it is called the Purple Heart, and it is a medal which is given for being wounded by the enemy in action. It represents sacrifice for your country. So the Purple Heart features Washington's face, just like the dollar bill does, but the Purple Heart shows a great deal more value. The other item is a bit of an oddity. Ordinary stout piece of steel here, tubular in nature with a funny little shaping on the end of it. South Carolinians, you may have seen the statue of George Washington at our South Carolina State House on the front steps. Very distinct piece of public art there, and a very old one. In fact, it's so old that the cane that George Washington carries in that statue actually was broken by General Sherman's vandals in 1865 when a bunch of Union soldiers celebrating the capture of the city began to get into some devilment on the State House grounds. One of the things they did was break the cane of the statue of George Washington, which was an odd thing to do since Washington was considered a hero by both sides of that terrible war. But these men were probably inebriated and all control had been lost. In any case, this is none other than the section that was made to repair the cane of that statue on the State House grounds after the second time that it was broken. The first time it was done by soldiers rioting. The second time, apparently, a politician in South Carolina early in the 20th century had a revolver accidental discharge and shot off George Washington's cane on the State House. This repair piece somehow wound up in the collection of the museum. The broken cane of George Washington at the State House has never been repaired. So folks, I went 20 minutes and then a couple extra minutes for artifacts today, but I hope you have 15 minutes to spend with me on Tuesday when, through the eyes of Roosevelt and Lodge, we will take a look at that great American hero, Daniel Boone, and the founding of Kentucky. In the meantime, I had better not hold for any questions today, but you can reach me with questions by email at the South Carolina Confederate Relic Room and Military Museum. So thank you all very much, and may the rest of your day proceed